The wind howled through the pines as the first flakes of snow began to fall against the weathered cabin windows. Rebecca Collins stood motionless behind the door, her fingers wrapped around the hunting rifle her grandfather had taught her to use. The weapon was almost as tall as her shoulder, yet she held it with steady confidence. 2 winters alone on Blue Ridge Mountain had stripped away any hesitation. The knock came again, weaker this time. Not the heavy pounding of a bear's paw, but something else, something human. Rebecca's breath fogged in the cold air of the cabin as she adjusted her grip on the rifle. Have you ever stood at the edge of everything you once knew, with nothing but wilderness ahead and ghosts behind? 9 months earlier, Rebecca had watched everything she'd built over 15 years dissolve in a single afternoon. The artisan goods company she had transformed from a struggling shop into a thriving business. Gone. Her ex-husband's family had executed their plan with surgical precision, manipulating legal loopholes until she found herself standing outside the building she once owned, clutching a cardboard box of personal items. They had taken everything but her grandfather's cabin on Blue Ridge Mountain, a property they deemed worthless. The knock at the door grew more insistent, desperate. Rebecca positioned herself where the door would shield her when open, just as her grandfather had taught her. "Who's there?" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. Only the wind answered at first. Then, "Please, my daughter, we need help." A woman's voice, thin and frail. Rebecca hesitated, her mind racing through possibilities. Hikers rarely ventured this far up Blue Ridge this time of year, and the locals believed the reclusive woman of the mountain preferred solitude. No one had climbed to her cabin in months. She unbolted the door, pulling it open just enough to peer through the crack, rifle ready. The sight that greeted her made even Rebecca's hardened heart catch. A woman painfully thin, clutching a small girl of perhaps 5 to her chest. Both were soaked through by the freezing rain that had preceded the snow. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes sunken with exhaustion, and something else Rebecca recognized immediately, the distant look of approaching death. She'd seen it in her grandfather's eyes before he passed. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Nowhere else to go." The little girl stared at Rebecca with wide, frightened eyes, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her pale face was streaked with tears, blue lips trembling from cold. Rebecca hesitated. The isolation she'd built around herself suddenly felt tangible, like a wall she couldn't see past. Her instinct was to turn them away. The mountain was no place for strangers, especially not a sickly woman and a child. Her cabin barely accommodated her alone. Yet something in the child's frightened eyes pulled at a memory. Herself, kneeling beside her grandfather's bed, watching his labored breathing, knowing she would soon face the world alone. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. As they crossed her threshold, Rebecca felt a strange certainty that her carefully constructed solitude had just ended, whether she was ready or not. The woman collapsed into the room's only armchair. Her breathing labored and uneven. The little girl remained pressed against her mother, sad eyes darting around the unfamiliar cabin, lingering on Rebecca's rifle, now propped against the wall. "I'm Grace," the woman managed between shallow breaths. "This is Sophie." Rebecca set water to boil on the wood stove, her movements practiced and efficient in the small space illuminated by oil lamps. The cabin's interior revealed a life stripped to essentials. Handmade furniture worn with age, shelves of preserved food, herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Not a place of poverty, but of deliberate simplicity. "Rebecca Collins," she offered, her back to the visitors as she worked. Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Collins? James Collins' granddaughter?" Rebecca stiffened, her hands pausing over the mug she'd been filling. No one had spoken her grandfather's name aloud since the day she'd buried him. "Yes. They said you lost everything, that you came up here to hide away." Rebecca turned, facing them fully for the first time. Something flickered across her face, a wound still raw beneath the surface. I didn't lose everything. I stayed. This is my home. Sophie hadn't spoken a word, her small hand clutching her mother's sweater, the stuffed rabbit dangling from her other arm. Rebecca recognized the look in the child's eyes. Not just fear, but the wary calculation of someone who had learned to be cautious around strangers. "You're the mountain lady," Sophie whispered suddenly, her voice surprisingly clear. "The one in the newspaper." Rebecca studied the child with new interest. "You've seen a photo of me?" Grace reached into her worn backpack, pulling out a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. Rebecca recognized it immediately. The story that had run after her ex-husband's family had taken everything. "Mountain Woman Retreats After Losing Family Empire," the headline read, alongside a grainy photo of the cabin taken from a distance. "I read this when they first diagnosed me." Grace's fingers trembled as she held the paper. Something about it stayed with me. A woman rebuilding in a place where most would see only emptiness. A ghost. That's what she'd become to the valley below. Rebecca supposed it was easier for them to believe that than to accept that a grown woman had chosen isolation over rebuilding her life in the world that had betrayed her. Grace's frame was racked by a sudden coughing fit, her thin shoulders shaking with the effort. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, Rebecca spotted the telltale specks of blood on her palm. "How long?" Rebecca asked quietly. Grace's eyes met hers, surprise and relief mingling in her gaze. Of course the mountain woman would recognize the signs. "The doctors gave me weeks, maybe less." She broke off, glancing at Sophie, who had begun exploring the small cabin, though never straying far from her mother. "Stage 4 everywhere." "Does she know?" Grace nodded, her eyes following her daughter. "Children understand more than we think, but understanding doesn't make it easier." Rebecca poured hot water into 3 mismatched mugs, adding pine needle tea, one of the first things grandfather had taught her to make. The familiar ritual steadied her hands, even as her mind reeled from the intrusion into her careful solitude. "Why here? Why me?" She placed a mug beside Grace, the steam rising between them like an unanswered question. Grace took a sip before answering. "Sophie has no one else." Her voice dropped to ensure Sophie couldn't hear. "Her father, Edward, is dangerous. When I left him, he swore he'd find us. Said Sophie belonged to him." Rebecca watched as Sophie carefully examined the wooden figures on the shelf. Bears, wolves, foxes, each carved with surprising detail. Grandfather had taught her carving to keep her hands busy during the long winter nights when the silence grew too heavy. "You want me to protect her from him?" The words felt strange in her mouth, she who had failed to protect even herself. Grace shook her head, then winced at the movement. "Not just that. I want you to teach her how to survive. Like you did." The absurdity of the request hung in the air between them. Rebecca had retreated to the mountain, not survived it. She'd been running away, not building something new. "I'm not even sure how I survived," Rebecca admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Some days I'm still not sure I will." "But you have." Grace reached for her hand, her skin paper-thin and burning with fever. "For 9 months alone." Rebecca pulled away gently, uncomfortable with the touch. "There's something you're not telling me. This isn't random. You didn't climb this mountain in your condition on a whim." "You're right." Grace's eyes drifted to the far wall where a simple charcoal drawing hung, one of grandfather's creations. 2 figures, one tall and dark with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. The other a swirl of light resembling flames. "The Shadow Hunter and the Fire Keeper," Grace whispered, using the old mountain terms. A chill ran up Rebecca's spine that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. "My grandmother drew that," she said. She told stories about them, about how light and shadow need each other, but sometimes fall out of balance. My grandmother told me the same stories. Grace's voice grew animated despite her weakness. Elizabeth Collins was her sister. Rebecca's mug stopped halfway to her lips. What? Elizabeth was my great aunt. She left the mountain as a young woman. Grace nodded, reaching again into her bag. She pulled out a faded photograph showing a family gathered outside a cabin. This cabin. A corner had been torn away, but Rebecca could clearly make out her grandfather as a young man. Next to him stood a woman who must be Elizabeth, and beside her, "That's my grandmother, Margaret," Grace explained. "Sophie is your blood, Rebecca, your second cousin, once removed." Rebecca stared at the photograph, at the torn edge where someone had been carefully removed from the family portrait. The mountain seemed to shift beneath her, foundations she thought solid crumbling into questions. "I didn't come to you just because you survived alone," Grace continued. "I came because Sophie belongs with family. Family who understands the mountain and its ways." Rebecca looked at Sophie, who was now sitting cross-legged before the fireplace, whispering secrets to her stuffed rabbit. Family. The word felt foreign after so many months of solitude, after years of having only her business as her identity. "Blood doesn't always make someone family," Rebecca said carefully, memories of her ex-husband's betrayal still bitter on her tongue. "No," Grace agreed, a knowing sadness in her eyes. "But it's a place to start." Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. Rebecca woke first, her body attuned to the rhythms of dawn after months on the mountain. As she kindled the fire, her gaze fell on Grace, who slept fitfully on the small cot in the corner. Beside her, wrapped in furs and blankets near the fire, Sophie slept peacefully. Something had changed in the night. Rebecca had felt it before falling asleep. A shift in the air, in the very fabric of the mountain itself. She moved to the window, peering out at the fresh blanket of snow that covered everything. Near the tree line, she noticed something unusual. Tracks in the snow, too large for any animal that should be on this mountain, with a strange elongated shape. The tracks led directly to the cabin door, then stopped, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. Rebecca frowned, rubbing her eyes to clear the morning fog. She'd been alone too long, her imagination filling the emptiness with shadows. Yet when she looked again, the tracks remained, undeniable in the clear morning light. She turned back to the sleeping figures, unease prickling along her spine. Her eyes fell on the table where she'd left Grace's journal the night before. Something new caught her eye. A small flame, no bigger than a candle's, danced above the leather cover. It cast no shadow, and when Rebecca cautiously approached, she felt no heat radiating from it. Rational explanations tumbled through her mind. A trick of the light, exhaustion, the angle of the sunrise through the window. Yet the flame moved as if responding to her presence, growing slightly brighter before extinguishing itself completely. In its place remained a single scorch mark on the journal's cover, a perfect imprint of the firekeeper symbol from her grandmother's drawing. Rebecca touched the mark, expecting it to be warm, but the leather was cool beneath her fingers. She had spent her life believing in things she could touch, build, and sell. Now the foundations of that practical world were shifting beneath her. Sophie stirred on her bed of furs, mumbling in her sleep. "Mama, don't go with the stars yet." Rebecca knelt beside her, unsure whether to wake her or let her cling to the last moments of unconsciousness before reality crashed in. The decision was made for her when Sophie's eyes fluttered open, immediately searching the room. "Mama?" "Sophie," Rebecca began gently, choosing her words with care. "Your mother's journey ended in the night. Her spirit has gone to join the stars, but her love stays with you always." Sophie's gaze moved past Rebecca to the still form on the cot. "Is Mama sleeping?" "No." Rebecca said gently. She's not sleeping. Her body stopped working, and she can't come back. But mountain people believe that our spirits live on in the sky. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. The stillness in her grief unsettled Rebecca more than screams would have. Children should cry, should rage against such injustice. This quiet acceptance felt wrong somehow, too adult for her small shoulders. Have you ever watched a child grapple with loss? They teach us how to grieve with honesty, something many of us have forgotten how to do. Before Sophie fully woke, Rebecca noticed the silver locket clutched in the child's hand. She gently helped Sophie place it around her neck, where it seemed too large for her small frame, yet somehow fitting. She'll always be with you, Rebecca said, indicating the locket, and now we need to prepare to honor her passing in the mountain way. The mountain people had their own rituals for death, not the formal ceremonies of organized religion, but practices born from generations of living close to nature's cycles. Grandfather had taught Rebecca these rites, and she'd performed them for him as best she could. Now she would show Sophie, preserving the traditions that connected them to this land. Together they wrapped Grace's body in her best blanket, placing wildflowers from her journal between the folds. The ground was too frozen for proper burial, but Grandfather had shown Rebecca the alternative, a stone cairn on the eastern slope where morning sun would warm the rocks. As they worked, Rebecca explained each step to Sophie, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. We return her to the mountain that she came from. Her body feeds the earth while her spirit joins the sky. Sophie listened solemnly, asking occasional questions that revealed both her childish understanding and surprising wisdom. Will flowers grow from where Mama rests? Can she see us from the stars? Does it hurt to become a star? Rebecca answered as honestly as she could, drawing on Grandfather's teachings while adapting them for Sophie's young mind. In doing so, she found herself reconnecting with beliefs she'd set aside in her focus on survival, like long-forgotten rooms in a house she'd been living in, but never fully explored. My business was everything to me, Rebecca confessed as they placed the final stones on the cairn. When I lost it, I thought I'd lost my purpose. I came to the mountain to hide, not to live. Sophie placed a small bundle of pine needles among the stones. Is that why you're sad inside? Mama said sometimes people smile on the outside but cry on the inside. Rebecca looked at the child in surprise. Your mother was very wise. She said you would teach me to be strong. Sophie's amber eyes studied Rebecca with unexpected intensity. She said you know how to start over. The words struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Starting over had never been her intention. Surviving, yes, but not beginning again. Yet here was this child, looking at her not as a failure who had retreated from the world, but as someone with strength to share. I'll try, she said finally. It was the most honest promise she could make. 3 days after Grace's passing, Rebecca stood by the window, watching Sophie arrange pine cones in careful patterns on the floor. The child had been unnervingly quiet since the burial, speaking only when necessary, her eyes constantly drawn to the forest edge, as if watching for something. A knock at the door startled both of them. Rebecca reached for her rifle, pushing Sophie behind her before cautiously approaching. Who's there? Martha Jenkins, came the reply. Village elder. Rebecca recognized the name. Grandfather had spoken of her with respect. Still, she kept the rifle ready as she opened the door a crack. An elderly woman stood on her threshold, her weathered face showing no surprise as she took in Rebecca's defensive stance. Rebecca Collins, your grandfather's child in spirit if not in blood. How did you find us? Grace's letter. She held up a folded paper. She sent it before coming up here. Asked me to follow if she didn't return in 3 days. The mention of Grace's name convinced Rebecca to lower the rifle slightly. She's gone. 3 nights ago. Sorrow crossed the old woman's face. I feared as much when I saw the shadows' tracks leading here. May I come in? There's much to discuss, and the little one shouldn't hear all. The mention of the tracks made Rebecca's decision. She stepped back, allowing Martha inside. Sophie had retreated to the corner with Rabbit, watching the stranger warily. Martha Jenkins, Rebecca said to Sophie, the village elder. She knew your mother and my grandfather. Sophie said nothing, but her grip on Rabbit relaxed slightly. Martha surveyed the cabin, her gaze lingering on the charcoal drawing of the shadow hunter and firekeeper. You've seen it then, the hunter. Rebecca hesitated, scientific skepticism wrestling with what her eyes had witnessed. I've seen tracks outside the cabin, and something. She glanced at the journal with its scorched symbol, uncertain how to describe the impossible flame she'd seen. It's drawn to grief and fear, especially in children, Martha said, her voice low enough that Sophie couldn't hear. It feeds on their pain, promising relief but taking their essence instead. Rebecca glanced at Sophie, who was now arranging pine cones in a pattern that looked suspiciously like the protective symbols carved above the cabin doors and windows. I don't believe in fairy tales, Rebecca said, though the conviction in her voice had weakened since Grace's arrival. Belief isn't required for truth to exist, Martha replied simply. Your grandfather understood that. Grace's letter mentioned concerns about Sophie's father, Martha continued after a moment. Edward Bennett has been seen in the county, asking questions about his daughter. He can't take her, Rebecca stated, moving protectively closer to Sophie. Grace's will named me as guardian. The will is being challenged, Martha interrupted grimly. Edward has filed papers claiming Grace was mentally unstable when she wrote it, that she'd developed paranoid delusions about him due to her illness. The implications settled heavily in the small cabin. If a judge believed Edward's claims, the will would be invalidated. Sophie could be returned to her father regardless of Grace's wishes or the girl's desires. When? Rebecca demanded, her mind already calculating options, escape routes, supplies they'd need. Hearing is set for 3 weeks from now. Judge Lancaster is fair. He'll listen to all sides. But Edward has money for lawyers, and he's Sophie's father by blood. Blood isn't always family, Sophie said suddenly, echoing Rebecca's earlier words to Grace. He wants to give me to the shadow hunter. Martha's weathered face grew grave. The sanctuary, she said quietly. Has Grace told you about it? Rebecca nodded. There's a map in her journal, a cave behind a waterfall. The sanctuary is meant for dire need only, Martha warned. Opening the door changes things on the mountain. Rebecca wanted to press for more information, but Martha raised her hand, signaling she'd said all she intended to on the matter. Build your home, she advised instead. Show the court you're creating a proper place for Sophie. I'll bring help from the village when the snow clears. After Martha left, Rebecca sat beside Sophie, watching her arrange and rearrange the pine cones. Do you want to talk about your father? She asked gently. Sophie's hands stilled. He looks like me, but he's not like me inside. He's empty. She pointed to her chest. Here. Did he hurt you? Rebecca asked, dreading the answer. Not me. Mama made sure, but he hurt her. Sophie picked up a pine cone, studying its spiral pattern. And he talks to the shadows. He says they give him power. Rebecca thought of the ex-husband she trusted, the family who had smiled while plotting to take everything from her. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us worst. Are you going to send me away? Sophie's question was direct, her eyes unblinking. No, Rebecca answered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. You're staying here, with me, because we're blood. Rebecca considered this, thinking of the people who shared her blood but had betrayed her, and this child, a stranger days ago, who now seemed to belong on the mountain as much as the ancient pines. Because we're family, she corrected, and that's more than blood. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find Sophie standing by the window, her silver locket clutched tightly in one small hand. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, joining her. "The mountain is warning us," Sophie whispered. "Someone's coming. Someone hurt." Rebecca peered out into the swirling snow, seeing nothing but white. During her months alone, she would have dismissed such a statement as childish imagination. But after the tracks, after the flame dancing above Grace's journal, she found her certainty wavering. "How do you know?" she asked, studying Sophie's face. "I just know," Sophie replied simply. "Like how I know when storms are coming or where the deer sleep. The mountain tells me." Rebecca hesitated, torn between skepticism and what her eyes had witnessed these past days. "Show me," she said finally. Outside, the snow had accumulated nearly 2 feet overnight. Sophie moved with surprising confidence, leading Rebecca toward a small clearing near the tree line. There, half buried in snow, lay a man with one leg bent at an unnatural angle. "He's still alive," Rebecca confirmed, checking his pulse as grandfather had taught her. "But barely. We need to get him warm." Together they constructed a makeshift sled from pine boughs, securing the unconscious man upon it with strips of cloth from Rebecca's pack. The journey back to the cabin was arduous, both straining against the weight as they dragged their burden through deep snow. By the time they reached the cabin, Rebecca's arms trembled with exhaustion. They managed to get the man inside and onto her sleeping furs near the fire. Only then could they examine him properly. A man in his 40s, well-dressed despite his disheveled state, with features that seemed vaguely familiar. "His leg is broken," she determined, carefully cutting away his pant leg to reveal the compound fracture. "And he has frostbite on his fingers and ears." "We should call Dr. Wilson on the radio," Sophie suggested, already moving toward the device Martha had left them. Rebecca nodded, turning back to their patient, and found herself staring into open eyes. The man was conscious, watching her with an intensity that made her instinctively reach for her knife. "Don't be afraid," he rasped, voice weak from exposure. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Who are you?" Rebecca demanded, keeping her distance. "Why are you on our mountain in winter?" The man attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement jarred his broken leg. "My name is Robert Bennett. I believe you've been caring for my niece." "Bennett?" The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. This man was related to Edward, to Sophie, but Grace had never mentioned a brother-in-law. "Sophie," she called, not taking her eyes off the stranger. "Come here." Sophie approached slowly, eyes widening as she saw the man was awake. She stopped just behind Rebecca, peering around her protectively positioned arm. "Hello, Sophie," the man said gently. "You've grown since I last saw you. You look like your mother." Sophie's grip tightened on Rebecca's sleeve. "I don't know you. No, you wouldn't remember. You were just a baby." He coughed, the sound rattling ominously in his chest. "I'm your father's brother, your uncle." Rebecca breathed, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. "You left the key in our cabin." Robert nodded, grimacing as another wave of pain washed over him. "I've been watching, making sure you were safe." "Safe from what? The shadow hunter or your brother?" His gaze moved to Sophie, who still clutched Rebecca's sleeve. "Both. My brother is not well. Hasn't been for many years. He believes in the old mountain legends, but misunderstands them, twists them." Dr. Wilson arrived that afternoon, setting Robert's broken leg and treating his frostbite. After diagnosing developing pneumonia, he left antibiotics but warned that Robert would need a hospital once his condition stabilized. That evening, Robert woke more lucid than before, accepting the broth Sophie offered with shaking hands. "Thank you," he managed between sips. "Both of you, for saving me." Why were you on the mountain? Rebecca asked, determined to get answers while he was coherent. The truth? Robert sighed, setting the empty bowl aside. I came to warn you. Edward knows about the sanctuary. He plans to use it at the new moon, 3 nights from now. Use it how? Rebecca pressed. The sanctuary isn't just a safe place. It's a doorway to the deep places beneath the mountain. Places of power. His voice dropped lower. Edward believes he can harness that power through Sophie, through her connection to the mountain spirits. Sophie's small face paled. He wants to give me to the Shadow Hunter. In a way, Robert's expression was grim. He believes he can control the hunter, use its power for himself, but the hunter controls those who seek to use it. Always. Rebecca shook her head, scientific skepticism resurging. These are just stories, mountain legends. Then how do you explain the tracks outside your door? Robert challenged. The flame that marked Grace's journal? Sophie's ability to hear the mountain? Rebecca fell silent, the rational explanations she clung to growing thinner by the day. The Collins and Bennett families have always been connected to this mountain, Robert continued. Our grandmothers were sisters who shared the old knowledge. But somewhere along the way, the Bennetts turned towards shadow while the Collins remained keepers of the flame. And you? Rebecca asked. Which side are you on? I was once like Edward, Robert admitted, shame evident in his voice, drawn to the power of shadow. But I saw where that path leads, to emptiness, to hunger that can never be satisfied. I've spent years trying to undo the damage I helped cause. He shifted, wincing as the movement jarred his broken leg. When Grace fled with Sophie, I helped hide them, kept watch from a distance. You're the one who told her about me, about the mountain woman. Robert nodded. I knew your grandfather, respected him. When I learned his granddaughter had returned to the mountain after losing everything, I thought perhaps the bloodlines were meant to reunite. Mountain blood is strong in both of you. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. What do we do? Sophie asked, her voice small but steady. If my father is coming... Robert reached for the silver locket around Sophie's neck, examining it with reverence. The sanctuary must be opened before Edward attempts to use it, by those with the right intention, by firekeepers. But Martha said opening the door changes things on the mountain, Rebecca countered, that it's only for dire need. This is dire need, Robert insisted. The balance must be maintained, light and shadow, above and below. He looked directly at Sophie. Your mother was a keeper. The power passed to you. Sophie clutched her locket, uncertainty evident in her young face. I don't know how to be a keeper. The mountain will guide you, Robert assured. It already speaks to you, doesn't it? Warning of storms, showing you where to find what you need. The child nodded slowly. Then you already know more than you think. His gaze shifted to Rebecca. And you, with your grandfather's blood, have kept the protections alive without even understanding their purpose. Together you can open the sanctuary, claim it, before Edward corrupts it. Rebecca sat by the fire long after Sophie had fallen asleep, watching the flames dance and thinking of everything she'd lost and gained. Her world had once been defined by spreadsheets and profit margins, by the validation of success. Now it was pine-scented air, wooden carvings, and a child who looked to her for safety. I still don't fully believe, she admitted to Robert, who remained awake despite his exhaustion. You don't need to believe in something for it to be true, he replied, echoing Martha's words. The mountain doesn't care about belief. It simply is. Rebecca watched the shadows cast by the fire, thinking of how easily shadows could deceive, appearing larger or smaller than the objects casting them, changing with perspective. I lost everything once, she said quietly. My business, my reputation, my sense of purpose. I'm not sure I can risk losing again. What about the risk of not trying? Robert asked. Of letting Edward take Sophie? Of allowing the shadow hunter to grow stronger? Rebecca looked at Sophie's sleeping form, at the silver locket that rose and fell with her breathing. I never wanted to be responsible for anyone but myself again. And yet here you are, Robert observed. Perhaps the mountain had plans for you all along. The day before the new moon dawned clear and cold, the storm clouds that had protected them finally dispersing. From the cabin window, Rebecca could see the valley below, smoke rising from chimneys into the crystalline air. Somewhere down there, Edward Bennett was waiting, perhaps already planning his ascent to the mountain. We go tonight, she decided, watching Sophie carefully arrange their ritual items in a deerskin pouch. Before the new moon, establish our claim first. Robert, propped up against the wall with his splinted leg extended, nodded approval. The hunter will be weaker tonight, easier to keep at bay. As dusk approached, Rebecca packed their supplies, lantern, food, extra blankets, the ritual items, and both keys. Sophie dressed in her warmest clothes, the silver locket secure around her neck. What if it doesn't work? She asked, a rare glimpse of childish uncertainty breaking through her composure. Rebecca knelt to her level, adjusting the woolen cap over Sophie's ears. In just days, this child had somehow worked her way into spaces of Rebecca's heart she thought permanently closed after her betrayal. Then we run. We know the mountain better than he does. We can hide until the hearing. And if it does work, what then? The question gave Rebecca pause. What did working even mean in this context? Protection from Edward, certainly, but Robert had hinted at greater implications, changes to the mountain itself, to their connection with it. Then we face whatever comes, she said finally, together. Have you ever found yourself making a choice that would change everything? Standing at the crossroads of what was and what could be. Robert watched them prepare from his position by the fire. Remember, he called as they reached the door. Both keys turn together. Speak the words exactly as I taught you, and whatever you see on the other side of the door, know that it's only as powerful as you allow it to be. The cryptic warning lingered in Rebecca's mind as they made their way through the snowy forest. The moon cast blue-white light across the landscape, creating stark shadows between the trees. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and their footsteps crunched loudly in the silence as they approached the frozen waterfall that concealed the cave entrance. Rebecca sensed a change in the air, a heaviness, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Sophie felt it too, her pace slowing, her hand seeking Rebecca's. He's already here, she whispered, her eyes wide. Waiting. Your father? Not him. Sophie pointed toward the ice-covered rocks surrounding the waterfall. The hunter. It knows what we're going to do. As if in response to her words, a shadow detached itself from the darkness between two pines, taller than any human, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It made no move toward them, simply watching with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. Rebecca felt fear rise in her throat, primal and instinctive. All her skepticism dissolved before the undeniable reality of the creature before them. She stepped slightly in front of Sophie, a protective gesture as ancient as motherhood itself. It can't stop us, she said with more confidence than she felt. We have the keys and the right words. We belong to this mountain as much as it does. They approached the frozen cascade, cautiously circling to find the narrow ledge that led behind the ice. The hunter followed their movement, gliding parallel to their path but maintaining its distance. Behind the curtain of ice, the cave mouth yawned black and uninviting. Rebecca lit the lantern, its warm glow creating eerie reflections in the surrounding ice. Together they made their way down the tunnel toward the circular chamber where the stone door waited. The door looked just as it had on their previous visit, perfectly round, covered in concentric rings of symbols, with two keyholes positioned one above the other. What they hadn't noticed before was how the symbols seemed to shift subtly in the lantern light, as if they weren't quite fixed in place. "Ready?" Rebecca asked, removing the iron key from her pocket while Sophie unclasped the silver locket from around her neck. The child nodded, her face set in determination beyond her years. Together they positioned the keys in their respective holes, silver above, iron below, and began to recite the words Robert had taught them. The language was unfamiliar, older than the mountain settlements, with sounds that seemed to vibrate in the chamber's still air. As they spoke, the symbols on the door began to glow, first faintly, then with increasing brightness until they outshone the lantern. A low humming sound filled the chamber, rising in pitch as the final words were spoken. "Now," Rebecca whispered, "turn the keys." They twisted the keys simultaneously, feeling resistance at first, then a sudden release as internal mechanisms engaged. The door began to move, rotating slowly inward like a massive coin on edge, revealing darkness beyond, but not complete darkness. As the opening widened, Rebecca could see points of light within, not lanterns or torches, but something like stars suspended in midair, constellations in impossible configurations. The humming crescendoed to a pitch that was almost painful, then stopped abruptly as the door completed its rotation. In the sudden silence, Sophie's intake of breath seemed unnaturally loud. "It's beautiful," she whispered, staring into the chamber beyond. And it was beautiful in a way that defied description. The space before them wasn't a normal cave room, but seemed to extend infinitely, filled with those star-like lights that cast no shadows, yet illuminated a path forward. "We need to enter," Rebecca reminded her, recalling Robert's instructions. "Claim the sanctuary before—" A noise from the tunnel behind them cut her off, not the unnatural silence of the hunter, but human sounds. Footsteps, multiple sets. Sophie clutched Rebecca's hand, her face pale in the otherworldly light. "He's here," she whispered. "My father." The tunnel behind them filled with approaching footsteps, echoing off the stone walls. Rebecca pulled Sophie closer to the open sanctuary door, positioning herself protectively between the child and whatever was coming. "We have to go in," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" Three figures emerged into the circular chamber, a tall man in an expensive coat flanked by two burlier companions. His amber eyes, so like Sophie's, narrowed as he took in the scene before him. "Sophie," Edward Bennett's voice was surprisingly gentle. "It's time to come home with father." Sophie shrank against Rebecca, fingers gripping the older woman's coat. "This is my home now." Edward's expression hardened, any pretense of gentleness vanishing. "Step away from my daughter," he commanded Rebecca. "This doesn't concern you." "She concerns me," Rebecca replied, chin raised defiantly despite her racing heart. "And this mountain concerns me. You don't belong here." A cold smile crossed Edward's face as he stepped forward. "I have more right to this place than you know, Ms. Collins. My family has tended these secrets for generations." He gestured to the open sanctuary door, including that. "You know nothing about tending," Rebecca countered, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Only taking, like you took Grace's peace, like you tried to take Sophie's future." Edward's smile faltered, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "You know nothing about me." "I know more than you think," Rebecca replied. "I recognize the hunger in your eyes. I've seen it before, in the people who took everything from me." "Interesting," Edward studied her with new calculation. "Perhaps we're not so different, you and I. We both understand loss, the drive to reclaim what was taken." "We're nothing alike," Rebecca stated firmly. "What I lost was things. What you want to take is a child's soul." "Dramatic," Edward scoffed. I merely want what any father wants, my child's potential fulfilled. By sacrificing her to shadows? Edward's facade cracked slightly, surprise flickering across his features. So you do understand. Good. Then you know you can't stop what's meant to be. One of his companions moved suddenly, lunging toward them. Rebecca reacted instinctively, pushing Sophie through the doorway into the sanctuary while dodging the man's grasp. She tumbled through after Sophie, both of them landing on what felt like solid ground despite the Starfield appearance. Edward's shout of rage echoed behind them as the door began to close. Not from anyone's action, but of its own accord, as if the sanctuary had recognized its rightful guardians and was sealing itself against intruders. You think you've won? Edward's voice reached them as the gap narrowed. This isn't over, Collins. Everything you build, I'll take, just like the others took from you. Everything you love, I'll destroy. The door sealed with a sound like a single crystalline note, cutting off his threats and leaving them in the impossible space of the sanctuary. Inside, the star-like lights swirled around them, illuminating a circular chamber unlike anything they'd expected. Instead of a cave, they stood in what appeared to be an observatory of sorts, with a domed ceiling displaying constellations that no human astronomer had ever mapped. Rebecca, look, Sophie whispered, pointing to the center of the room. A column of gentle flame rose from a stone pedestal, casting warm light throughout the chamber. As they approached, the flames seemed to respond, brightening and extending tendrils of light toward them like welcoming arms. What do we do now? Sophie asked, her small face illuminated by the ethereal fire. Before Rebecca could respond, a voice spoke, not aloud but directly into their minds. Warm as sunlight and ancient as the mountain itself. You have come home, children of the mountain. Sophie gasped, tears filling her eyes. Mama? Not exactly, the voice replied, tinged with Grace's familiar warmth, but containing something more. Countless voices blended into one. I am all the keepers who came before, including your mother. We protect the balance between worlds. The flame shifted, forming a vaguely human shape. For generations, the Collins and Bennett families were guardians together, one to tend the flame, one to watch the shadows, until division came. Edward's pounding on the stone door echoed distantly, as if miles away rather than mere feet. He seeks to control what cannot be controlled, the flame continued, to claim shadow without respecting its purpose. What is its purpose? Rebecca asked, finding her voice at last. Balance. Light needs shadow as summer needs winter. Neither can exist alone. The flame flickered. But now you must choose. Claim the sanctuary permanently, binding yourselves to its protection, or return to the world above and face what comes. Rebecca hesitated. All her life, she had defined herself by what she built, what she owned, what she accomplished. Then when everything was taken, she defined herself by what she'd lost. Now she was being offered something entirely different. Not possession, but purpose. Not ownership, but belonging. She looked at Sophie, seeing not just a child in need, but family. The family she had never expected to find in her solitude. Sophie's hand found Rebecca's, small fingers intertwining with determination. We stay, she declared. Together. Rebecca squeezed her hand in agreement. We protect the mountain. As family. The flame brightened, expanding to encircle them both in warmth that felt like an embrace. Then it is done. Outside, Edward's pounding ceased abruptly as the sanctuary door melted seamlessly into the surrounding stone, vanishing completely. The mountain rumbled once, deeply, then fell silent, sealing the sanctuary from those who would misuse it. Edward staggered back, watching in disbelief as his access to power disappeared before his eyes. No! He screamed, pounding uselessly against solid rock. This is my birthright. Mine! But the mountain had made its choice, and no amount of rage could change that. Edward collapsed to his knees, feeling the shadows that had once whispered promises of power now turning their hunger toward him instead. 1 year later, visitors to Blue Ridge Mountain spoke of changes both subtle and profound. The storm seemed gentler somehow, the paths clearer for those who approached with respect. Wildlife flourished, and even the streams ran clearer than before. They told stories of two figures sometimes seen near the frozen waterfall, one tall with knowing eyes that had seen both loss and renewal, the other small with a silver locket that caught the light like a star. Rebecca's cabin had expanded, with a new room for Sophie, a thriving garden, and signs of a true home. No longer a retreat from the world, but a beginning. She had started a small business selling mountain herbal remedies, finding new purpose in sharing the mountain's gifts rather than merely hiding upon it. Robert had recovered from his injuries and now lived in a small cabin nearby, serving as both uncle to Sophie and bridge between the mountain folk and valley dwellers. His knowledge of both worlds proved invaluable as Rebecca navigated the legal battle for Sophie's guardianship, a battle they eventually won when Edward's increasingly erratic behavior revealed the truth of Grace's concerns. On particularly clear nights, those who knew where to look might glimpse a gentle flame burning in the high window of the cabin, a light that never extinguished, no matter how fierce the winter winds blew. The mountain gives what we need, not always what we want, Rebecca would tell visitors who made the journey up to her door. Sometimes what we lose only clears the path for what we truly need to find. She would look at Sophie then, the child who had brought purpose back to her life, and know that some treasures could never be taken away, not family, not belonging, not the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, new beginnings wait just beyond the horizon. The mountain had found its keepers, and they had found their home.